What's better than being so scared that you shit your pants? How about shitting your pants with your friend? Today we're talking about couch co-op survival horror games. The Outbreak series is kind of known for not being very good. There's a number of games in the series, each a tribute to classic horror games, from survival horror to first-person shooters to top-down twin-stick shooters. But the thing most of these games have in common is that they can be played in local co-op with a friend. That alone piques my interest. You don't see a lot of couch co-op horror games, so whenever that comes around, I gotta at least try it out. I don't want to talk negatively about these games, as they were created by a single developer, and to me, that in and of itself is an impressive accomplishment. But that being said, yeah, of course, these are not the best horror games. There's a lot of issues here. But the most recent game in the series is called Outbreak Endless Nightmares. It attempts to blend survival horror and roguelike elements, but it ultimately delivers a frustrating and bewildering experience. Players find themselves repeatedly exploring the Nexus, a haunted building aiming to collect 50 conductor coins for escape. Progress unlocks new areas in the hub, but the gameplay, featuring tank controls reminiscent of early Resident Evil titles, feels cumbersome. Combat against uninteresting enemies with weak weapons lacks strategy, and weapon durability proves infuriating. The ability to switch between multiple perspectives adds unnecessary complexity, and the game's visuals are lacking in detail and plagued by frame rate issues. Overall, Outbreak Endless Nightmares fails to deliver an enjoyable experience, with its ill-fitting roguelike elements, making it a recipe for frustration. Ultimately, Outbreak Endless Nightmares is not the best experience. If you're like me and you've played a lot of early 3D games, you probably have a high tolerance for jank. So I still think that there's some fun that could be had in these games, but go in with an open mind. Let's talk about the Obscure games. Obscure, the 2004 PS2 title, is a solid survival horror game that deserves a revisit this Halloween. It successfully captures the essence of cheesy teen slasher films and translates it into an engaging survival horror game. Set in the eerie halls of Leafmore High, players embark on a suspenseful journey as a group of students facing bizarre occurrences, mutated classmates, and perilous challenges. The game cleverly leverages light sensitivity as a key mechanic to fend off enemies, adding an interesting twist to the genre. While the plot may be campy and cliché, it's precisely these elements that make Obscure a nostalgic gem. The game's co-op mode enhances the experience, allowing friends to navigate the school's eerie corridors together and face the tension-filled narrative head-on. So if you're seeking a classic horror gaming experience with a dose of nostalgia, Obscure is well worth a playthrough, especially during this Halloween season. Obscure: The Aftermath is another decent survival horror game. Although I don't think it's as good as the first game, it still has a lot going for it. Guiding a group of characters, each with unique abilities, through perilous monster-infested environments still captivates players. However, as we revisit the game in today's gaming landscape, it becomes apparent that Aftermath might not retain the same level of novelty it once held on the PS2. For whatever reason, the low-budget acting and production value aren't quite as endearing in this game. There's also a Nintendo Wii version, but that one has a lot of weird motion controls that I think are pretty terrible, so just stay clear of that version. The PS2 version's much better. Nevertheless, the cooperative gameplay remains a standout feature, allowing players to navigate the chilling world of Aftermath with a friend. Unbearable is another indie title that was created by a single developer. It delivers a dark and gritty narrative that pays homage to the survival horror games of the PS2 era. Players follow Claudia, former reporter, as she embarks on a harrowing investigation of the enigmatic psychiatric hospital Milagros. Along the way, she encounters both allies and obstacles while uncovering the asylum's sinister secrets. The game offers a cooperative campaign, allowing you to brave the chilling tale alone or with a friend in split-screen mode. Traversing through immersive environments, you'll tackle puzzles and choose between stealthy evasion or confrontations with enemies, using a variety of melee and ranged weapons. The inventory system adds depth, requiring you to collect, manage resources, and combine items for puzzle solving. While the game's atmosphere and narrative hold promise, it falls short due to some janky animations, awkward hit detection, and technical issues reminiscent of a low-budget indie game. But despite its quirks, Unbearable hints at the potential for a unique co-op horror experience, provided the developers refine their skills. This game is still in early access, so let's hope that this one gets a little bit more polish, but overall I like the concept. Vaccine Rebirth brings a refreshing twist to survival horror gameplay, reviving and improving upon its predecessor, Vaccine. The addition of survival puzzles, a map system, and a wealth of new content make for a compelling experience. While it pays homage to classic titles like Resident Evil, the procedural generation of environments adds a unique twist. The RPG leveling system keeps the game challenging, yet rewarding as you face increasingly formidable foes. Co-op enthusiasts will find enjoyment in tackling this atmospheric adventure together, and while it has its quirks and some room for improvement, Vaccine Rebirth's potential shines brightly as it continues to evolve. In the indie game space, we see a lot of tributes to the 8 and 16-bit era, but there are a lot less games that are trying to capture the look and feel of early 3D games. Vaccine Rebirth does a great job of making you feel like you're playing an old survival horror game on the PS1 or Sega Saturn. The graphics are faithful, the tank controls are there. It has just enough jank to make you feel like it was an intentional choice to pay tribute to the games of the 32-bit era, rather than bad game design. So if you're a fan of the early Resident Evil or Silent Hill games, this one should be right up your alley. Let's talk about some of the Resident Evil games with co-op. The first one I want to talk about is Resident Evil DS, or Deadly Silence. See what they did there? That's pretty clever, huh? This game came out on the Nintendo DS, and it's basically a recreation of the original Resident Evil game. This one introduces a mode called Rebirth, where you can play in the same setting of the original Resident Evil, but it introduces some unique elements like touchscreen mechanics. I'm not personally a fan of touchscreen or motion controls. I feel like they're a bit gimmicky, but if you wanted to try something new, there you go. But what makes this one stand apart is that you can play it in co-op. If you have two Nintendo DSs, you can team up with a friend and explore the original Resident Evil environment. But what's weird about it is your teammate will show up as like a star on your screen, and you can't really interact with each other. So there is somewhat of a disconnect there, but you are able to team up and fight enemies together. If you're able to play this on original hardware, or maybe emulating the system linking through PC, this is a really fun experience. And I had no idea this existed until this year, so I'm just really excited about it personally. Resident Evil 5 is the game that a lot of people consider to be the start of the downfall to the franchise, but I will always defend this game. It definitely has less survival horror elements and leans more towards an action-based game, but the cooperative gameplay is what really makes this game stand out. Playing this in single player, I could see why people didn't exactly take to this game, but when you play this with an actual friend and you don't have to deal with the most annoying AI ever, you can really talk things through, work through puzzles together, team up, and take on the various enemies. And I think that's what makes this game shine. Of course, there's some problematic things in the African environment. The representation of these people is, doesn't hold up great. It's kind of, there's definitely some racist going on, but let's just pretend that doesn't exist. To me personally, Resident Evil 5 is one of my favorite co-op games of all time, and I would love to see the series come back to include some of the elements from this game. But when it comes to Resident Evil games and co-op gameplay, the best is definitely Resident Evil Revelations 2. The game's episodic structure keeps players hooked as it weaves a narrative web across two timelines, featuring well-known characters like Claire Redfield and Barry Burton, along with intriguing newcomers like Moira and Natalia. The cooperative gameplay mechanics shine when players must utilize each character's unique abilities to navigate tricky situations. While the environments and enemy design can feel uninspired, the classic Resident Evil puzzles add some much-needed depth to the experience. Ultimately, Resident Evil Revelations 2 is a solid addition to the franchise. This is another excellent co-op experience, where each character has their own specific roles, and you have to work together to make it through the environment. This is my favorite Resident Evil game. As somewhat of an honorable mention, I wanted to talk about a new game that just came out this October. It's called Mazepocalypse. It's kind of like a mix between Pac-Man and Resident Evil, with some RPG elements as well. It might not look like much, but I think this is such a unique concept. You can play it with up to 4 players cooperatively. The campaign mode invites you to choose from 6 distinct scenarios, each comprising 5 challenging mazes, and concluding with epic boss fights, with 8 diverse playable characters, each boasting unique stats and abilities, and a plethora of unlockable costumes. Mazepocalypse promises an enthralling zombie-slaying adventure. You move through the maze, collecting items. When you run into an enemy, instead of just dying, you actually have the opportunity to fight them. There's item management, you have limited ammunition, so there's a survival horror element as well. This is what I like about indie games, is you take multiple concepts and you put them together in scenarios where you think they might not fit. But this is one, it just stands out to me. And obviously this is way different from the other survival horror games on the list. It's not a traditional survival horror, but it has those elements, and I just wanted to mention it just for its uniqueness. The survival horror game I wanted to talk about last is definitely the most unknown game in the video. It's called 7 Mansions, and it came out exclusively on the Sega Dreamcast in Japan. Luckily, we finally got a fan translation a few years ago. We can play through this cooperative experience in English. This might be the first co-op survival horror game of all time. It plays similarly to Resident Evil or Silent Hill, and it has a unique story as well. It's not the most polished game, but it's definitely a product of its time. You and a friend can team up, and you can play this either with a dynamic split screen, which doesn't work very well, or you could play it with fixed cameras where you're both always in first-person view. Recommended. It's disorienting otherwise. But this is a true cooperative experience where you split up and you have to communicate, where one person will be looking at hints and trying to tell the other person how to solve a puzzle. You got to communicate and use both players' environments to figure out how to move forward in certain scenarios. This game isn't perfect. It has a lot of problems. The combat is absolutely terrible. But just the fact that it's a co-op survival horror game that came out in the Dreamcast era and pretty much nobody ever talks about it made me want to highlight it. It's definitely a hidden gem from the era. What are your favorite couch co-op survival horror games? What did we miss? And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to watch this video where we talked about the best co-op retro horror games. Thank you for watching.